Everyone knows Tyrannosaurus rex. It is the undisputed king, the very symbol of prehistoric power and the terrifying majesty of a lost world. For decades we have understood it as the single dominant apex predator of late Cretaceous Larimedia. The landmass that would one day become the western portion of North America. It was a tyrant lizard and it was a king. But what if that story, as simple and powerful as it is incomplete? What if the king did not rule alone? What if the throne of the tyrant lizards was occupied not by one species, but by a royal family of 3? And what if the king, T-Rex, wasn't even the most imposing member of that dynasty? This is the explosive premise of a new scientific paper that challenges our most fundamental understanding of the world's most famous dinosaur. The idea comes from Gregoris Paul, a veteran paleontologist and paleoartist, whose influence on the field is difficult to overstate. If you've ever seen a sleek, dynamic, and anatomically rigorous illustration of a dinosaur, you are looking at the legacy of his work. He literally redrew the dinosaurs for the modern era, authoring foundational books like the Princeton Field Guides to Dinosaurs and Predatory Dinosaurs of the World. But with a long and storied career comes a willingness to push boundaries, and sometimes to propose ideas that the scientific community finds, to put it mildly, controversial. This isn't the first time Paul has attempted to fracture the throne of Tyrannosaurus. In 2022, he led a study that first proposed this very idea, that the single species of Tyrannosaurus rex should be split into 3. He named them Tyrannosaurus imperator, the tyrant lizard emperor, Tyrannosaurus rex, the familiar tyrant lizard king, and Tyrannosaurus regina, the tyrant lizard queen. According to that paper, the emperor was the oldest and most robust form. The king came later and was slightly less heavily built. And the queen, a contemporary of the king, was the most gracile and slender of the 3. That 2022 paper was met with a near-unanimous chorus of criticism from tyrannosaur experts. It was heavily scrutinized, its methods were questioned, and for the most part, the idea was dismissed and largely forgotten by the broader public. But now, Paul is back, and he has doubled down. A new 2025 paper resurrects the argument for the imperial trio. It doesn't stop there either. The paper also argues that the world of Tyrannosaurus was far more crowded than we believed, populated by multiple medium-sized, long-armed relatives running around as direct competitors, including the infamous Nanotyrannus. The paper is dense, its methods are, as we will see, highly questionable, but it also raises some genuinely thought-provoking points. In the spirit of scientific inquiry, we owe it to the idea to examine the evidence presented, to set aside our preconceptions about the one true king, and to ask a simple question: does the tyrant lizard emperor have a legitimate claim to the throne? Paul's central justification, a point he repeats throughout the paper, is one of consistency. He argues that other dinosaur genera, like the horned Ceratosaurus, the predator Allosaurus, and even fellow Tyrannosaur Dyspaltosaurus, have been split into multiple species based on what are often fragmentary remains and relatively subtle diagnostic characteristics. He contends that his attempt to do the same with the far more complete fossil record of Tyrannosaurus was met with unfair hostility. Simply because he was tampering with a celebrity dinosaur, there is a certain logic to this appeal for fairness. Scientific standards should be applied consistently across the board, regardless of a fossil's fame. So, with that in mind, let's give the argument its day in court. What is the evidence for this royal family of tyrants? The first pillar of the argument is robusticity, a measure of how heavily built an animal is. Paul separates the 3 proposed species based on the stoutness of their femurs and the width of their skulls. The specimens he assigns to Tyrannosaurus imperator are, by his measure, the most robust. This group includes some of the most famous and massive Tyrannosaurus skeletons ever found: Samson, the colossal Sioux, Moro 08, a specimen he renames Bill. These are the heavyweights, with skulls that are wider and bones that are thicker. Following them is Tyrannosaurus rex, slightly less robust and appearing later in the fossil record. This group includes the iconic Scotty, the official holotype specimen CM 9380, and the more recently discovered Tufts-Love specimen. Finally, there is Tyrannosaurus regina, the most gracile and lightly built of the 3, said to have coexisted with T-Rex. This royal court of queens includes well-known skeletons like Stan, Harley, Thomas, Wankel, and Black Beauty. Immediately, several very large red flags appear. The first is the issue of ontogeny, or the changes an animal undergoes as it grows. The list of specimens for each proposed species is a mix of fully grown, mature adults and younger subadult individuals. It is a well-established fact in biology that animals, especially large vertebrates, tend to get more robust as they age. A lanky teenager will often grow into a broader-shouldered adult. By mixing individuals of different maturity levels, the data is immediately compromised. How can we be sure that the perceived gracility of a Regina specimen isn't simply a reflection of its relative youth compared to a fully mature, robust imperator? Without strictly comparing individuals at the same growth stage, sorting them by robusticity is like trying to define different human species based on a sample group that includes both 16-year-olds and 40-year-olds. The second, and perhaps more damning, issue lies with the data itself. The paper provides measurements for the femurs, but it crucially fails to state the measurement standards. It does not specify at what point along the bone the measurements were taken. The diameter of a femur can vary significantly along its length. Measuring at the mid-shaft will give a very different result than measuring near the joints at either end. If different specimens were measured at different points, the entire dataset becomes meaningless. It's an apples to oranges comparison that tosses the entire femur-based diagnosis out the window. Furthermore, the paper neglects to include femur circumference data. In modern paleontology, robusticity is often calculated as a ratio of the bone's circumference to its length. Without the circumference, estimating robusticity is simply impossible. Then there is the issue of stratigraphy, the study of rock layers, which provides the timeline for when these animals lived. Paul's argument rests on the idea that the robust T. imperator is found in lower, older rock layers, while T. rex and T. regina are found in higher, younger layers. This chronological separation is essential to his hypothesis of an evolutionary trend. Yet, in the supplementary information for the paper, he makes the baffling claim that stratigraphy doesn't need to be precise to support his stratigraphy-based argument. This is a statement that fundamentally contradicts the very principle he is trying to use as evidence. If your argument is that one species predates another, you absolutely need precise and reliable dating of the rock layers they are found in. To dismiss the need for precision is to dismiss the foundation of your own claim. The evidence presented here is far too flawed and inconsistent to justify the creation of two new species. The second major line of evidence involves the postorbital bosses, which are small, rugose protrusions of bone located on the postorbital bone, right above and behind the eyes. Paul provides specific definitions for the bosses of each species. Tyrannosaurus imperator is defined as having postorbital bosses that sometimes form a long spindle and lack the tall, protruding discs seen in T. rex. This brings us to T. rex itself, which, according to the paper, has postorbital bosses that are sometimes prominent, subcircular, knob-like discs. And what of Tyrannosaurus regina? Its bosses do not project much above the dorsal rim of the skull and are sometimes hat-shaped, presumably among mature males. The recurring word here is sometimes. A diagnostic feature, the very thing that is meant to uniquely identify a species, cannot be a feature that is only sometimes present. It's like defining a species of bird by the fact that it sometimes has a red crest. This is not a reliable diagnostic trait. It is a description of individual variation. Furthermore, the descriptions themselves are highly subjective. What, in quantitative anatomical terms, is a hat-shaped boss? This is not a measurable scientific descriptor. The problem is compounded when you look at the holotype of T. rex itself, the specimen CM 9380. It doesn't even preserve the postorbital region of the skull. So, if the anatomical data is so inconsistent and subjective, where did these clear-cut species definitions come from? How was this conclusion reached? Paul expands on his methodology. He states that he utilized a cutting-edge, entirely objective, quantitative method he calls the human visual neural pattern recognition. To quote him directly, if two specimens look like the same species taking size and possible sexual differences into consideration, they probably are. If they don't, they probably are not. In other words, he just looked at them. There was no rigorous phylogenetic analysis, no mathematical scoring of dozens of anatomical characters, no computational matrix to determine evolutionary relationships. The methodology was, for all intents and purposes, vibes. To be fair, pattern recognition is the starting point for all paleontological inquiry. A scientist sees something that looks different and forms a hypothesis. But that hypothesis must then be tested with rigorous, objective, and repeatable methods. Simply stating that things that look different probably are different is not the conclusion of a scientific analysis. It is the very first step. The illustrations within Paul's own paper undermine his case, showing a wide range of variation in postorbital boss shape even within the species he is trying to define. The paper proposes a few other, more minor diagnostic characters. It suggests that T. regina and T. rex are characterized by having only one small, incisor-like tooth at the front of their lower jaw, while T. imperata usually had two. Relying on the placement of one or two teeth in a heterodont animal is an exceptionally weak basis for erecting new species. Tooth count and placement can vary due to age, injury, or simple individual difference. A more intriguing idea is that across all three species, the individuals with larger postorbital bosses are more likely to be male. The bosses could have been used as display structures to impress females or for intimidating rivals. There is another aspect of Paul's work that casts a shadow over his analysis of robusticity, his famously low body mass estimates. For decades, Paul has been a proponent of what critics often call shrink-wrapping dinosaurs, reconstructing them with a bare minimum of soft tissue, resulting in lean, almost emaciated-looking animals. In this new paper, he continues this trend, placing giant Tyrannosaurus specimens like Sue and Scotty at less than 8 metric tons. Modern studies using digital models and accounting for a plausible amount of muscle consistently place these animals in the 9 to 10-ton range, or even heavier. A 2009 study by Bates and colleagues created a digital model of the T. rex specimen Moore 555, also known as Wankel rex, and found that to get its weight down to just 6.3 metric tons, they had to shrink-wrap it to a point where the animal looked horrifically starved. This persistent habit of underestimating mass and soft tissue volume calls into question his entire visual assessment of what constitutes robust versus gracile. Frankly, the idea of Tyrannosaurus imperator is incredibly appealing. The name itself is epic, the tyrant lizard emperor. If valid, this species would contain the most robust Tyrannosaurus specimens, making it, on average, the largest and most massive adult theropod dinosaur known to science by a significant margin. The thought of a species that includes titans like Sue, the Cope specimen, and Samson is a thrilling prospect. But the reality is that the case for the tyrant lizard emperor, as it currently stands, is built on a foundation of inconsistent data, subjective interpretation, and flawed methodology. Attempting to split T-Rex was not the only controversial take in this paper. Paul also argues for the existence of multiple other tyrannosaur species that lived alongside the members of the genus Tyrannosaurus. He makes a case for the validity of Nanotyrannus, the dwarf tyrant, a long-debated animal that many paleontologists consider to be nothing more than a juvenile T-Rex. Paul's arguments for Nanotyrannus include its higher tooth count compared to an adult T-Rex, forelimbs that are proportionally as large or even larger than those of an adult T-Rex. While the case for a crowded tyrannosaur landscape is intriguing, it requires much more rigorous study. This brings us to the final piece of the tyrannosaur puzzle, Tyrannosaurus macrinensis. This is another more widely accepted potential species of Tyrannosaurus, named in 2024 from remains found in New Mexico. Its validity hinges almost entirely on the age of the rocks it was found in. If it is Campanian, it would predate T-Rex by 5 to 7 million years, making it almost certainly a distinct ancestral species. If it is Maastrichtian, it would be a contemporary of T-Rex. This real-world example highlights the critical importance of precise, data-driven geology and stratigraphy in defining species, a level of rigor that seems absent in the argument for T. imperator and T. regina. In conclusion, while the vision of a royal family of tyrants is a powerful and exciting one, the scientific case for it is incredibly weak. The evidence presented is plagued by methodological issues, from mixing age groups to using inconsistent and unstated measurement standards. The diagnostic characters, particularly the postorbital bosses, are defined by subjective, non-quantitative terms. And the entire hypothesis is ultimately justified by a method of visual pattern recognition that lacks scientific objectivity. Science, of course, advances by challenging dogma. The idea of a single, monolithic T-Rex is a hypothesis like any other, and it should be tested. But any challenge must be supported by strong, clear, and verifiable evidence. This paper, unfortunately, does not provide it. The throne of the Tyrannosaurus, for now, remains occupied by a single king. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the science of the tyrant lizards and appreciate this kind of detailed analysis, please consider leaving a like on the video and subscribing to the channel for more content like this. Thank you for watching.